Hi, and welcome to the second installment of Chapter 1 Reasons for the Cold War in Europe. In this part, we'll be focusing on the manifestations of the Cold War, which is just a very cheap way of saying what did the Cold War look like and what were the examples of the Cold War taking place. Let's begin by taking a look at the first one, carving out political and economic spheres of influence. Now, the setting up of Cominform and Comecon as a way of rivaling or competing against the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan led to the creation of two exclusive and competing blocs. Now, a bloc is just another big word for a large group of people or countries with the same political aims working together. Right. As a result of this competition, Europe became increasingly divided along political and economic lines. Okay? And by taking a look at this map, we can see quite clearly those who participated in the Marshall Plan, those who are in blue are the Comecon members, and there's this special group of people, the Greys, okay, which basically indicate countries which did not participate in this competition, which is Spain, Yugoslavia, and Finland. Okay, so the areas which are colored uh, represent the division between East and West, and this is where the Iron Curtain would supposedly be like. All right, let's move on to the next part. Now, you come across this word quite frequently in your source-based questions, so I thought it'd be good if you actually know what it means. This word bipolarity describes a situation where only two countries in the world possess the greatest economic, cultural, and military influence. If by now you don't know who these two countries are, you must be incredibly gifted. Now, it's used to describe the state of division in Europe and the world during the Cold War. And that's all there is to know about bipolarity. Now, one of the examples of the Cold War taking place would be this superpower confrontation in the Berlin blockade. Okay, now, what happened in Berlin, if you recall earlier, Germany was divided into four parts, and the part which is controlled by the Soviets is further developed into another four parts, okay, controlled by the different superpowers Soviets, American, French, and the British. Now, Stalin was very unhappy with the success of the Allied powers in the areas which he controlled, and his long term plan for Germany was that it would become communist. On the other hand, the Western powers, particularly the USA and Britain, were anxious to keep the rest of Germany under their own sphere of influence. Now, although the Soviet Union had agreed, there were certain roles which the different superpowers played. Now, one of the responsibilities of the Soviet Union was that they had agreed to ship food and basic commodities to the western zones in Berlin. However, this aid did not materialize, and the USA became even more suspicious about the Soviet Union's intentions in Germany. Now, to give you an example of what it's supposed to look like. Now, imagine that Berlin, the capital of a country, is our school. Okay, and in our school, it's divided into two parts: Eastern Yihua and Western Yihua. Now, in the eastern part of Yihua would be where the canteen is located, and the western part of Yihua is where the canteen is not located. So basically, if I say I give somebody the responsibility on this side, where the canteen is, to deliver food over to the west side, that's a very important role because without this food, the west side would actually starve to death. as it would not receive food from anywhere else. So, in this instance, Soviet Union, who was in control of East Berlin, was responsible for bringing the food in to West Berlin. And however, they did not do so. Now, the Berlin blockade was considered the first major Cold War crisis, as well as the first international crisis after World War II. I'm going to go on to describe what this Berlin blockade was all about and how it actually came about. Now, uh, a new currency was introduced called the Deutschmark, which replaced the old and now worthless Reichsmark and Rentenmark in the Western zones. Okay, this was to avoid problems like hyperinflation, which Germany underwent in before World War II. Okay, this actually led to a strong economic recovery in the Western zones. Stalin also introduced his own new currency, but it didn't do as well, and partly due to, you could call it jealousy or competition, he decided to take revenge by imposing a blockade on movement into West Berlin by cutting off all land and water pathways as well as communications. Now, this also meant that food supplies and electricity to the West Berlin were also cut off. Why did Stalin do this? It's basically to starve the Germans in West Berlin into submission and surrendering, and forcing the Western powers to abandon their plans in West Germany and to leave West Germany. What Stalin didn't count on was that USA and Britain had agreed to a decision to transport supplies into West Berlin by air, which was the only channel not blocked by the Soviet Union. So, in June 1948, the Western powers flew supplies into West Berlin for the next 11 months. At one point of time, there was a plane reaching Berlin every 30 seconds. Now, the Soviets did not shoot the planes of the Western powers down for fear of being seen as engaging in the act of war. Now, one thing you have to take note of is that uh, the two countries, as far as possible, try to avoid direct confrontation or any kind of confrontation that might be seen as an attack or an act of war. Now, alright, sorry about that glitch. Now, this is what it would look like in Germany. Now, as I mentioned, this area was controlled by the Soviet Union and it blocked off all supply routes going into the western part of Berlin. So, what the other countries, the superpowers, did was they flew in supplies from their own side in order to make sure that there was sufficient food and resources for everybody. Now, I also mentioned that the Communist army didn't shoot down any of them. Now, this is quite a funny example. Uh, any of the Allied powers transportation, aircraft transport, because it will be seen as war. Okay, here you see a very angry Joseph Stalin thinking about shooting the birds carrying different types of items such as coal and food. Alright, so I think you'd have a better idea of what these things look like. Now, realizing the blockade was an epic failure, Stalin decided to reopen the land and water routes into West Berlin. Now, there were about 2.3 million tons of supplies that had been flown into West Berlin during the crisis, and two-thirds of which was coal, which, if you can guess, was basically to fuel, to act as fuel for the electrical power stations, so that there will be electricity for everybody. So we see here, uh, Western German children cheering an American cargo plane, okay, landing. Now, the failure of the blockade humiliated the Soviet Union, but it also boosted the credibility of the Western powers, demonstrating once again why the West was better than the communists. Now, what happened later on as time went by, West Berlin became part of West Germany and East Berlin became part of East Germany. So the awkward or funny part of it was that the capital, they were essentially within Germany, there were two different countries altogether. And this was as a result of competition between Soviet Union and the United States. We now move on to forming military alliances. Uh, Military, as you would know, plays a very important part in history. Now, the crisis over Berlin showed how close these two countries were from going to war. Now, the presence of large numbers of Soviet troops stationed in Eastern Europe led the USA and the Western European countries to be concerned about the military security of Western Europe. So instead of being worried about Germany, the Western powers were instead concerned about a strong Soviet Union. Such concerns led to the USA as well as the different Western European countries to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. This is a formal military alliance in 1949. The inclusion of West Germany into NATO later in 1955 caused the Soviet Union to form its own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact, with its Eastern European satellite states. Now, the Western European countries were very fearful about the possibility that the Soviet Union would actually try to spread its influence through the use of military means, okay? Like basically forcing its influence through using its army. So, the members of NATO agreed to come to each other's defense if they were attacked by any external party, which in this case meant the Soviet Union. Okay, if you recall, this sounds a lot like how the military alliances were formed before World War One started. And in fact, uh, if you recall, it was because of these military alliances that World War One actually started and started to spread. Of course, the Soviet Union saw the formation as NATO as a threat to them, and naturally, they always have something to actually rival or compete with that. So the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact with its Eastern European satellite states on the 14th of May 1955. Similar to NATO, member countries of the Warsaw Pact pledged or agreed to defend any other member country which might be attacked by an external party. Now, although it seemed very good, in reality, the main objective of the Warsaw Pact was to defend the Soviet Union against any further invasion, especially from Western Europe. Okay, again, we see that most of what the Soviet Union does seems to only benefit them. If you recall in the earlier lecture, we talked about how Germany uh, gave sold oil to the Eastern European satellites in return for very cheap prices of other raw materials. So there was this sense that the Soviet Union was exploiting other countries. So, not surprisingly, the members of NATO and the Warsaw Pact members are similar to that of the map for those who participated in the Marshall Plan and those that did not participate in the Marshall Plan. Okay, so again, we see several countries. The one in green, Warsaw Pact members, the ones in yellow, NATO members, and the one in orange, not belonging to either NATO or the Warsaw Pact. So how we move on to the extension and international impact of the Cold War. So what was the big deal about the Cold War? Now, Cold War tensions began to have a strong impact on the rest of the world as they were increasingly pressured to support either side or adopt a non-aligned stance. Now, it would be difficult for some certain countries not to be aligned to, let's say, for example, America, if that particular country needed help. Okay, so this is an example of a poster showing trying to get people to support. It's your choice. Where do you draw the line against communist aggression? So it tries to display a very scary red color sweeping over the different nations. Okay, so countries that tended to support the to take a side usually required the help of economic aid in the form of America. Okay, so like I said, what was the big deal about the Cold War? The Cold War basically, there are several examples which we'll get into as the chapters progress. One of them of which is the Korean War, which lasted from 1950 to 1953, which was the first international armed conflict since World War II. And it was the first proxy war of the Cold War, first proxy war of the Cold War. Now, leaders, there was an Bandung conference was the first large-scale meeting of Asian and African states in Bandung in Indonesia that led to the establishment of the non-aligned movement. Now, not all nations were wanted to be aligned to any country because that meant that they would be involved in something which they might be something that they might not want to be involved in. We also see the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, which is a very important symbol because it's the most long-lasting symbol of the Iron Curtain. Okay? The Soviet Union saw the more prosperous West Berlin as embarrassing reminder of East Germany's relative economic underperformance, as well as a suspected center for American spy activities against the Soviets. The Berlin Wall was built in 1961 and physically separated the West Berlin from the surrounding East Germany and prevented East Germans from escaping to or through West Berlin. You won't see a problem of West Berliners trying to escape to East Germany unless they're suffering from some mental problems. Now, many East Germans who tried to cross over to West Berlin were shot by Soviet soldiers, border guards, and the police. Okay, with that, we come to the end of part 2, the final part for chapter 1, reasons for the Cold War in Europe. In this next section here, we'll be looking at the mind maps which summarize all the points that we have gone through for this particular chapter. This will allow you to recap all the information which you have gotten so far. Alright, let's begin. So, reasons for the Cold War, which was in part 1. There were 3 main big reasons, and under these 3 main reasons are sub-reasons explaining that main broad reason. The first one is ideological conflict between the USA and the Soviet Union. Factor number 2 is a necessary alliance with continued distrust We went through how the alliance to resist German advance in Britain and the Soviet Union led to their alliance, the delay in opening a second front, and how that led to tensions between the two superpowers. We also talked about the disagreements during negotiations for a post-war settlement in the Yalta and Potsdam Conference. And we also talked about American nuclear monopoly and dropping of the atomic bombs in Japan, which led to which all these points lead to DNT between the two superpowers, which is, that's right, distrust and tensions. The third factor is worsening relations between the USA and the Soviet Union. The devastation of Europe and the rise of superpowers, we saw them being in a good position to influence the development of Europe. The end of wartime alliance and competition for influence between the superpowers, the establishment of Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe, the American adoption of the containment policy. If you recall, the containment policy was a way to contain the spread of communism, and Soviet responses to the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, which of course they did not like it one bit. Next, we move on to the manifestations of the Cold War and basically examples of how the Cold War starting. First, we talked about carving political and economic spheres of influence. We saw the superpower confrontation in the Berlin blockade. We saw the forming of military alliances with NATO and the communist version, which is the Warsaw Pact. And last but not least, we see the extension and international impact of the Cold War spreading to different parts of the world. And that brings me to the end of part 2 for chapter 1, Reasons for the Cold War in Europe.